It's 1943, and 50 Mitsubishi Zeros slice over the Pacific. After 2 years of ruling these skies, their pilots have grown cocky. The American fighters will turn and run in a moment. Except they don't. They're climbing up to meet them. The fight is on. The Zeros open fire first. Tracer rounds slam into fuselages. The Japanese pilots expect the familiar sight of enemy aircraft exploding, but their 20mm cannons, normally enough to shred American fighters to pieces, seem to bounce off their wings. But heavy armor means slow aircraft. They'll easily outmaneuver them. Wrong again. The newcomers pull into a steep climb, their 2,000 horsepower engines roaring at full throttle. What should be impossible is happening. These heavy fighters are gaining altitude faster than the lightweight Zeros can follow. The Americans fire back. 650 caliber machine guns per aircraft unleash streams of destruction that rip through Zero formations like paper. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat has entered the fight for the Pacific, and now it's an even match. America's nemesis. In the early 1940s, as Nazi dive bombers howled over London and Japanese warplanes reduced Chinese cities to ruins, American commanders were haunted by the idea of these aerial predators finding their way to U.S. shores. At the time, the U.S. Navy's top carrier-based fighter was the Brewster F-2A Buffalo. With a top speed of 321 miles per hour and 12 7mm machine guns, this early monoplane could deliver a punch, but it would be easily outnumbered if it were to come face-to-face with the Axis fighters. That moment would arrive on the morning of December 7th, 1941. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft descended on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Bomb bays opened, and explosions tore indiscriminately throughout hulls and airfields. In less than 2 hours, battleships were ablaze. The U.S. aerial fleet lay in ruins, and over 2,000 American lives had been lost. It was the first time the United States felt the full fury of Japan's aerial arsenal. The agile Mitsubishi A6M Zero, one of Japan's newest and most advanced fighters, tore through American defenses unbothered. In the early war years, it had earned a victory ratio of 12-1, establishing itself as the undisputed predator of the Pacific. The Zero didn't just outperform American fighters, it humiliated them. There were whispers that not even Hitler's Luftwaffe had a fighter capable of matching it. Yet America had no choice but to send its pilots up against them and pray for a miracle. Within hours of Pearl Harbor, the Zero returned, this time over the Philippines. Despite being designed for aircraft carriers, the A6M Zero boasted a combat range of over 500 miles, allowing it to reach nearly every American outpost in the region and deliver lightning-fast strikes. Even the most advanced U.S. aircraft stood no chance. Japanese fighters swept through formations of P-40 Warhawks and B-17 Flying Fortresses. American pilots often never even saw the Zeros coming. When they did, it was already too late. The skies belonged to Japan, and by May 1942, the Philippines had fallen, dealing the U.S. one of its earliest defeats of the war. Years later, a Japanese staff officer would confess, quote, "It was our Zero fighters which were most responsible for our success. In the Philippines campaign, 11th Air Fleet functioned like a smooth-running locomotive, and the Zeros were the pistons which propelled it forward." It was now obvious to the Americans that their current aircraft would not cut it. The U.S. was in desperate need of a new air defender. Buying time. Even before World War II began, the U.S. Navy had already begun planning for a warbird unlike anything the world had ever seen, a piston-engine fighter that could tear through the air at over 300 miles per hour, carry devastating armament, and endure the extensive distances of oceanic warfare. To bring this vision to life, the Navy turned to Chance Vought, an ambitious aerospace firm that reached for the most powerful engine it could find, the 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row 18-cylinder monster. With it, they crafted a radical machine, the XF4U-1 Corsair prototype, which became the first single-engine U.S. fighter to break the 400-mile-per-hour barrier. However, while a marvel of speed and power, the Corsair had a fatal flaw. It couldn't land. Its long nose blinded pilots on approach, its landing gear bucked like a Bronco, and its wing design caused unpredictable stalls during the final moments of a carrier landing. For all its promise, it wasn't ready for the decks of Pacific carriers. And so, American pilots had to make do with what they had, while engineers kept working day and night in order to deliver a combat-ready fighter. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was called in to hold the line. With 4 .50 caliber Browning machine guns and self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented explosions while under fire, it was a decent defender. Still, pilots knew it could never beat the Zero. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch spent sleepless nights hunched over his table, moving matchsticks across the wood like squadrons in the sky, inventing tactics that could give the outmatched Wildcats a fighting chance against the Japanese until a new aircraft arrived. Then one night, he suddenly saw it. The maneuver his aircraft had to perform next time it ran into a Zero. It was June 1942, amidst the dogfights of the Battle of Midway, when Thatch had the chance to test his idea in real combat. It was a risk, yet it was all he had. As 4 Wildcats sliced through the sky, a Japanese Zero locked onto Thatch's wingman. Instead of breaking formation, Thatch gave the call to execute the weave at once. Like gears in a clock, the Wildcats began a precision crossing pattern, turning into each other's flight paths. The pursuing Zero followed the bait, unaware it had entered a trap. As it lined up to strike, Thatch swung his Wildcat across the path and opened fire, lighting up the Zero's underbelly. The tactic stunned the Japanese. Aces like Saburo Sakai, who up until this point had been hunting American fighters with ease, later recalled the moment when his squadron witnessed the maneuver for the first time. Quote, 2 Wildcats jumped on the commander's plane. He had no trouble in getting on the tail of an enemy fighter, but never had a chance to fire before the Grumman's teammate roared at him from the side. The Thatch weave became standard operating procedure across the Navy and Marine Corps, buying enough time for the engineers back home to deliver the machine that would shift the battle. Unleashing hell. By late 1942, the F-4U Corsair was finally declared combat-ready. But there was a catch. The aircraft, though blazing fast and heavily armed, was still unable to fully master the art of landing on the deck of a carrier, forcing the Navy to confine it, at least for the moment, to land-based operations. Still, on the battlefield, the Corsair was nothing short of terrifying for the Japanese. Darting through the Pacific with 6 .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, each capable of spitting 400 rounds, it could shred enemy fighters in a heartbeat. If this wasn't enough, the Corsair could take it even further, unleashing up to 8 high-velocity rockets at its targets. For the first time, the Japanese Zero had met its match. But winning the air war would take more than raw power. America still needed a carrier-ready fighter that could be fixed on the fly, built by the thousands, and that any pilot could land in a storm. The Navy again turned to the F-4F Wildcat. This underdog had held the line when nothing else could. Perhaps if they could somehow upgrade it, it could become the fighter they were looking for. Grumman crafted a new design, one that would harness the same mighty Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine used by the Corsair. But to channel that 2,000 HP power, they'd need to build an airframe from the ground up. Pilots who had fought in the Pacific were brought to Grumman factories, tasked to help craft the strongest American naval fighter to date. The aces understood that what U.S. forces needed wasn't ultimate strength, but rather extensive resistance and ultimate operability. They demanded an aircraft with landing gear strong enough to absorb the violence of carrier landings, a high-mounted cockpit that allowed clear forward visibility during dogfights and safer deck approaches, and an airframe that was easy to repair, even if shot multiple times. The result was the F-6F Hellcat. It was tougher than the Zero, yet easier to fly than the Corsair. Its foldable 42-foot wide wings made it perfect for carrier storage, while its controls were so intuitive that Grumman proudly claimed it had been, quote, designed to be flown by 200-hour farm boys. From the moment its wheels left the runway, everyone knew this was the fighter that would win the war. Into the battle. On September 1st, 1943, aboard the USS Independence, 2 Navy pilots, Lieutenant Dick Loesch and Ensign A.W. Nyquist, bolted into the sky in newly minted Grumman F-6F Hellcats, racing into their first combat mission. Their target was Kawanishi H-8K Emily, a Japanese flying boat patrolling the open sea. As the Hellcats roared off the carrier deck, slicing into the haze with the guttural growl of the double Wasp engine, it became clear that no Japanese aircraft would ever be out of reach again. Ensign George Omer would later recall, quote, "The Hellcat was a terrific airplane. It was positively a piece of cake to fly, just a dream. The difference between the F-4F and the F-6F was night and day. We had more range, more speed, more power, more everything." Loesch and Nyquist closed in with the precision of a hunter, locking eyes with their target. Tracers laced the air, tearing into the lumber in Kawanishi. Fire bloomed across the sky, and just like that, it was done. The first confirmed victory by the Hellcat, swift and uncompromising. Both pilots returned unscathed, the mission a success. Just 2 months later, in November 1943, the Hellcat was called to the fight once more, this time over the Gilbert Islands, as the U.S. launched its offensive on Tarawa. As fleets of F-6Fs descended onto the battlefield, they faced off against some of the most experienced pilots Japan had to offer, flying on board the feared Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. Yet something had changed. The legendary Type 97 machine guns, once deadly to American aircraft, now failed to even scratch the Hellcat's thick hide. The American pilots, many of them barely familiar with combat, ripped through the Japanese formations as if they had decades of combat experience under their belts. By the end of the engagement, 30 Zeros were shot down, while only one Hellcat had been lost. From that moment, the F-6F Hellcat became the backbone of the U.S. Navy's carrier-based air power, and as American forces pressed their advantage island by island, the Hellcat was there on every carrier and every offensive. The Hellcat was so successful that it didn't take long before its might expanded beyond the Pacific. More than 1,200 F-6Fs were shipped to Britain, where Royal Navy pilots took them into the skies over Norway and the Mediterranean. There, they faced the best of the Luftwaffe, veterans of the Blitz in the Eastern Front. But even under concentrated fire, British pilots reported returning from sorties with aircraft riddled by enemy rounds, yet somehow still flying. One pilot described it best, quote, "There were mostly holes where the airplane used to be, more air going through it than around it." The final sortie. Lieutenant Commander Edward O'Hare had already made a name for himself by the time he first climbed into the cockpit of a Grumman F-6F Hellcat in 1943. He'd become the Navy's first ace of World War II the previous year, when, alone and nearly out of ammunition, he dove headfirst into a formation of Japanese bombers, threatening the USS Lexington, tearing down 5 of them. He'd been assigned to train green recruits, but the warrior in him craved for return to the front lines. And now, with the Hellcat beneath him, he had the perfect weapon to do it. While flying his F-6F, O'Hare wrote the new rules on air combat. Thanks to him, pilots knew never to strafe a ground target without checking their 6, nor hit the Betty bombers from the rear unless they wanted to eat a stream of 20mm fire. However, just as the Americans thought they had their opponent figured out, the enemy shifted strategies. Japan knew it could no longer win the fight, so it would instead work its way around it. Seeking to scurry past the American Hellcats, the Japanese commandos began to launch nighttime torpedo bomber raids, set to strike U.S. positions and flee before being caught. America's response was to launch a 3-plane hunter group known as a Bat Team, 2 Hellcats flanking a radar-equipped TBF Avenger. On the night of November 26, 1943, Butch O'Hare volunteered to lead the first mission himself. He launched into the darkening sky. Hellcat 00 took off the deck of the USS Enterprise alongside Ensign Warren Scahn and Lieutenant Commander John Phillips in the Avenger. At night, the ocean below was a pitch-black void, and the only way for pilots to navigate it was the radar pulses flickering in Phillips's cockpit. At first, the pilots flew nearly blind, unsure if there were even Japanese attackers out there. But then, contact. Before approaching, O'Hare issued a warning through the radio, quote, "Hey Phil, turn on those running lights. I want to be sure it's an enemy I'm drilling." They adjusted formation, flying tight and low. The Japanese aircraft was supposed to be nearby, yet none of the men in the formation could see them in the dark. Something was wrong. The gunner on board the Avenger looked behind, and there it was, a bomber right behind O'Hare's Hellcat. Gunfire erupted from both directions. In the chaos, O'Hare's lights blinked out. Seconds passed without a response from the pilot. Then a voice broke the silence, quote, "Mr. Phillips, this is Scon." I saw Mr. O'Hare's lights go out, and at the same instant, he veered off and slanted down into darkness. The rest of the formation could barely make it out alive, returning to base without O'Hare. At first light, aircraft scoured the ocean for any sign of him. A second search followed, but O'Hare had vanished, and with him, the hope that the F-6F could lead America to an unchallenged victory over the Pacific. A new challenger rises. While night raids had earned Japan some terrain over American air superiority, they knew it wasn't enough. The Pacific had once belonged to them, and now they would fight tooth and nail to get it back. Now, it was the Empire's turn to deploy a new fighter of their own, and it found it in a failed floatplane design, reconfigured as a land-based warrior, the Kawanishi N-1K Shiden. It was fast, resistant, and strong. But what truly set it apart were its combat flaps, controlled by a mercury switch. They deployed automatically during tight turns, giving pilots the edge in split-second dogfights, even against the F-6F Hellcat. Unlike the Zero, the N-1K was built to take a punch and keep rolling. American pilots watched in disbelief as 50-caliber rounds shattered against its canopy, only for the aircraft to keep charging at them as if nothing had happened. The fighters only became more menacing after the elite 343rd Kokitai got a hold of them. These hand-picked aces, led by the infamous Minoru Genda, soared into battle in Shiden Kais, the most advanced version of the N-1K, ready to go against any American formation attempting to approach the Japanese homeland. In one particular battle, the Japanese pilots dove their Shiden Kai straight into a wall of 300 U.S. aircraft, fighting their way through Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers. Despite being surrounded, the Japanese did not give up, and as the pilots dodged the incoming American fire, one fighter locked eyes with a Hellcat and came out behind him. With just a squeeze of the trigger, the Hellcat was gone. The N-1K quickly turned into Japan's Hellcat Hunter. Americans received reports of up to 4 F-6Fs being downed in a single sortie, with no Japanese losses in return. For a moment, it seemed like the technological dominance America had gained with the Hellcat was slipping away. But behind these successful dogfights, Japan was struggling to keep its fighters airborne. Despite its brilliance, the N-1K was a luxury the Empire could barely afford. Its advanced Homare engines were unreliable and troubled by inconsistent and rushed production. And while only 1,500 were ever built, many sabotaged by B-20 bombings and supply chain collapse, America was cranking out Hellcats off factory lines day and night. The N-1K, while deadly in close-quarters combat, struggled at altitude. When intercepting American B-29 superfortresses, it faltered, unable to climb fast enough or high enough to mount a reliable defense. Japan's industrial base simply couldn't keep up, and America was determined to take advantage of this weakness. Rematch. With their aerial strength bleeding dry, the Japanese were forced to deploy every warbird at their disposal, including their aging and outmatched Zeros. By the summer of 1944, the stage was the Philippine Sea. Over 20 carriers launched more than 1,300 aircraft. Among them flew a pack of improved Hellcats equipped with onboard radar and cutting-edge naval command systems. Amid this storm flew Lieutenant Alexander Verasiu. Seconds after takeoff, he knew something was wrong. His supercharger had failed, robbing his Hellcat of vital power and speed. But Verasiu didn't turn back. Instead, he pressed forward, one man against an entire squadron of dive bombers. Diving from the sun, he cut through the formation like a sword. Just 8 minutes passed before he'd already shot down 6 enemy bombers, each one taking him no more than 5 seconds of bursts of fire. By the time the battle ended, Japan had lost over 500 aircraft, more than 90% of its carrier-based air power, robbing Japan of the ability to mount any major carrier offensives for the remainder of the war. As for the Hellcats that made it happen, they flew home mostly untouched, their losses fewer than 2 dozen. By the last years of the war, there was no escaping the wrath of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat. The aircraft dominated the Pacific, weaving an impenetrable aerial net nicknamed by the Americans as the Big Blue Blanket. Still, in late 1944, Japan prepared for one last attempt to break the cover. A desperate, all-out counterstrike exploded across the Philippine archipelago. Over 200,000 sailors and airmen clashed in what would become the largest naval battle in history. Japan committed nearly every remaining warship and aircraft to halt the Allied landings, but they were outmatched before the first shot. The United States had trained over 17,000 new pilots since joining the war, flooding the Pacific with fresh, capable aviators. Japan, meanwhile, had managed barely 5,000 new recruits, many hastily trained and tragically underprepared. Realizing they could no longer match the Americans in traditional aerial combat, Japan turned to the ultimate alternative: kamikaze. On October 25th, the first waves of kamikaze aircraft streaked toward the American fleet, tasked with striking the carriers before their Hellcats could even launch. The first victims were the escort carriers USS Santi and USS Suwannee. Explosions ripped through their flight decks, igniting fueled aircraft and munitions. But it was the USS Sanlo that suffered the worst fate. A kamikaze smashed through her deck, igniting a chain of massive internal explosions. Fire engulfed her hangars. Ammunition cooked off in bursts of flames. With one final roar, the ship heaved and sank beneath the waves, taking aircraft and crew with her. But even that wasn't enough to ground the Hellcats. Launching from the smoke-shrouded decks of battered carriers, F-6F squadrons clawed into the sky, intercepting incoming kamikazes before they could find new targets. Hellcats sliced through the Japanese formations, tearing them apart with a round of salvos until the Japanese guns fell silent. It was the last major battle of World War II, and the Hellcats had helped the Americans win it. One last fight. However, the Hellcats' war didn't end in the Philippines, and as U.S. forces closed in on Japan by 1945, the aircraft was called to action once more. Pilot Don McPherson's squadron was dispatched to eliminate a remote island airstrip believed to be launching kamikaze sorties protecting the Japanese islands. As he swept in low on board his Hellcat, McPherson unleashed a storm of rockets, obliterating the crude runway below and scattering any enemy defenses he and his companions could find before turning back to base. The mission seemed complete. But then, McPherson saw them. A group of enemy aircraft flying just above the waves and heading straight for his formation. McPherson would later recall, quote, "It was a good thing I hadn't put my guns back on safe. I wouldn't have had time to get a shot off." He snapped into action, pulling the trigger and shredding the first bomber before it could fire. It slammed into the sea. But the rest tried to flee toward the same island McPherson and his squadron had just struck. McPherson gave them chase. But before he could reach them, a call came through the radio, quote, "Don, get out of there. They're shooting at you." Anti-aircraft guns on the ground opened up, flak bursts ripping through the sky around him. But McPherson didn't retreat. Instead, he unleashed 2 more volleys, hitting 2 more bombers dead on, sending them crashing before they could reach land. As McPherson witnessed his enemies sinking into the water below, he barely had enough time to turn back and make a run for it before the incoming flak found the hull of his Hellcat. That mission would be one of the last campaigns carried out in the Pacific by a Hellcat pilot, as weeks later, Japan finally surrendered and the war was finally brought to an end. After the war. By the end of World War II, the F-6F Hellcat had earned the title of one of the most lethal and successful fighter aircraft ever deployed by the United States. It accounted for 75% of all aerial victories claimed by the U.S. Navy during the war. In its campaign across the skies, the Hellcat flew over 66,000 combat sorties, downing thousands of enemy planes, while losing only 270 of its own in dogfights. Despite its impressive run, the Hellcat began a slow fade after the war, as the dawn of the jet age soon arrived, turning piston-engine aircraft obsolete. Still, some F-6Fs found a new life as remote-controlled flying bombs. These modified drones, part of early unmanned strike programs, were sent on one-way missions against hardened North Korean positions during the Korean War in the early 1950s. Other Hellcats were selected to aid the U.S. as it prepared to test atomic weapons in Bikini Atoll. Upon detonating nuclear bombs, Hellcats were launched without pilots directly into the heart of the nuclear clouds, equipped with measuring equipment and remote-controlled cameras to assess radioactivity levels and the effects on aircraft. Today, a handful of F-6Fs in the US and UK still remain operational, unfit to fight anymore, yet serving as a legacy for one of the biggest heroes the Pacific ever saw.